All right. Welcome again to the Check Your Privilege Talks with me, Maisha T. These conversations are open dialogue around the importance of moving beyond being a white ally, but working towards being a co-conspirator, centering Black women in the fight against patriarchy. However, we have to understand that the best way for white women to help win this fight is to acknowledge their privilege, work around it, and begin centering Black, Indigenous, and women of color in the feminist movement. So I want to introduce my guest today, Valerie Moore, who's a women's leadership coach. Valerie, why don't you tell the audience about what you do?
Well, I work with change makers who are wanting to really stand in their power, that they're trying to balance the masculine energy as bring their feminine side into it and be able to really work through some of the internalized oppression that they're carrying.
Oh, wow, that's heavy. So do you work with many women of color?
I have a couple of clients that are women of color, but I did a lot of work in corporate for many years, and there just wasn't that many women of color there, especially in executive level positions. So I worked predominantly with white men for many, many years.
Oh,
yeah.
That could be interesting.
So I'm making that shift and trying to create spaces as well as relationships to work with more women of color.
Awesome. Okay. So this question, kind of off the cuff, is when did you know that if you identify as a feminist, when did you know that you were a feminist? Like, what happened to spark that idea?
So I went to UC Santa Cruz for college, and it was my freshman year, and I took an intro to feminism class. And that was the first time that I had ever been in a community of women in a way that felt very empowered, that felt like they were not only challenging the outside world, right, in terms of the things that we confront, but also challenging some of the stuff we carry inside. And it felt like a sisterhood. So that was the first time where I really understood that some of the challenges that I have faced individually, other women had faced, and we faced collectively.
Awesome. And so while you had that understanding of that introduction of feminism, did you notice anything in particular with women of color being a part of the feminism movement?
Yeah, absolutely. So I went on after that class to get a women's studies degree. And throughout my classes, you didn't know that about me, huh?
It's like, what?
Yeah, so I did American politics and women's studies. And throughout that process, not only in terms of the text that we were reading, but the women that were present in the program, this was a big part of the conversation because the early feminist movement really boxed out women of color, right? Historically, not only, the Susan B. Anthony, suffrage movement, and then as well, even in the 60s, it was often white women saying, oh, well, hold on, talking about feminism and talking about all women.
Right.
They were really only talking about themselves when women of color would step in and say, but what about our experience, or what about this? It was often treated as like, well, yeah, we have to do this first and then we'll get to that. And so those conversations came up over and over again, not only in theory, but in practice.
So do you see that still happening now? Do you still see?
Yes.
No, I have to ask.
Okay. Yeah, I know. Well, and I have to be honest, and I have to own it. So I went to school, I'm 46 now. I went to college, and I came out of college and out of this community where we talked about these things. We talked about race. We talked about homophobia. We talked about sexism all the time, right? And then we did critical analysis of it. And then I left and went into the working world and completely lost my, how do I describe it? I lost my center on it, right? I was focused on trying to build my career, right? And like I mentioned, I started working and doing executive coaching and really kind of lost the ability to have that conversation. I lost the courage. So for many years, I fell back into my privilege. And it wasn't probably only a couple of years ago where all of a sudden I woke up to the fact of like, wow, I'm totally out of alignment. I can't continue like this. This is, and that remembering helped me to kind of come back to a grounded place with the fact that I have to be talking about it. I have to be having these conversations. I have to be in sisterhood again. And I have to check my privilege in a way that is not just when I want to or when it's convenient, but it has to be always, right? Like, and this is not just for some period of time until I get it, right? that you never arrive, right? Like this just has to be my new way of being in the world.
That's the idea, I think, Valerie, that some white women think that, oh, I've done my work, I'm done. And it's not done because it's constantly going to show up in your life every single day, right?
Yes. And we're living in it in a way where it's not behind us. I think that for a long time, we wanted to believe, right, that it wasn't an issue. And for white women specifically, since we're not living with it day in and day out,
right,
it's easy. If you're not very actively, consciously, intentionally working to check your privilege, to be anti-racist, to see it, you can be comfortable.
Yeah,
and that's what I feel like I did for many years. Is I was caught up in the fact that I could step away from it, and that realization, and the fact that was I understood that's not going to get it done. Right? If I want there to be change, if I want there to be something different out in the world, which I do, then I don't get to take breaks because women of color don't get to take breaks.
Absolutely. You're damn right we don't.
Yeah.
But I do also appreciate the idea that you actually recall like you
Oh, sorry. Hold on just 1 second. You're going to have to mute it. Pause it for a second.
That's okay. That was Val's dog. I call her Lassie. That is not her name.
Lucy.
But she looks like Lassie. Don't call her Lassie. I think only I can do that in my head. But yeah, like you kind of realized that you were living in privilege, and it sounds like you're comfortable getting uncomfortable, which takes us to this idea around allyship. And for those of you who don't know, allyship is this process that involves a lot of listening. It's acting in solidarity to the fact that you know something. So when we talk about white allyship, it's actually a white ally acknowledging the limits of their knowledge about a person's experience, but they don't use that as a reason not to think or act. Typically, white allies don't remain silent, but they confront racism as it comes up daily. So this was a definition that I got from a resource that I'll share in my Check Your Privilege Ally Guide. But Valerie, my question to you is, what does being an ally look like to you?
There's a number of pieces to it that have been evolving, and I assume will continue to evolve. But part of it's the inner work, right? Of being honest about the places and spaces where, even if I didn't intend, right, that I've been actually operating out of privilege and doing harm, right, to women of color, people of color, and that inner work is not comfortable. So this idea of being willing to not be comfortable, I think, is an important piece of this, because we live in a society, and I am, a white person, and in this society is built on white supremacy.
Right.
And it's not comfortable for me to say I'm a racist, because I want to be a good person, right? That's not what I want. That's part of white supremacy, though, this idea of perfecting things or being good, right? And this idea that we're always striving to do that. And for me, it doesn't matter what I intend, right? I'm operating and I'm benefiting from a system that marginalizes brown and black bodies. And that if I don't speak up, if I don't take action, if I don't do things, then I'm complicit in that.
So it sounds,
and that's, yeah, keep going.
Yeah, so it sounds like for you, an ally looks like someone who shows up in this system that's created for you to succeed, but for someone like me to fail.
And to use my body, to use my voice, to use all of my talents. So I had an episode back at the beginning of the year where I was out looking at the full lunar eclipse, right?
Right.
And I got the cops were called on me by one of my neighbors. And they came as if there was, I was a homeless person, is basically what they thought, because I had a blanket wrapped around me and stuff. And that was the first moment, actually, that I really understood privilege in a way, because they were very forceful. And I didn't understand really what was going on until I got back into my house after the whole incident was over. And I sat there and I thought to myself, what the fuck just happened, right? And in that moment, the next thought to myself was, oh shit, how would that have gone down if my neighbor 2 doors down, who's African-American, if that was him out there, right? And all of a sudden, it like hit me like a ton of bricks. Not only did my privilege get checked, but the fact that like, fuck, somebody else that probably wouldn't have turned out quite the same way, right? And so I wrote about it. I wrote a blog post about it that, not only shared my experience, but basically posited that question. And I continue to try to do those things just to get people talking and thinking and understanding from my perspective and my experience, sharing that as a way to, especially because people of color already know this. Like, I'm not really talking to them because they're like, yeah. But it's for, other, white women specifically. But, even talking to my husband about it, right? That was something that, and my kids, right? Not having it be just my own thing, but having it be something that as, my family, that this is something we talk about. So that's one way. The other way is that I do events, right? I do events for women in anger release. And this is a topic that is really, it's got a lot of charge to it for people. So
just to circle back real quick, Valerie, is this the work that you're doing to unpack your privilege? Or is this kind of still you talking about what an ally looks like to you?
So part of it was unpacking internalized depression. And it started out originally understanding it from the context of sexism, right? Because there's a lot of commonality when we come into circle together as women and we share the things, what our relationship with anger, what we're angry about. We not only are able to feel seen and heard, but then we're able to appreciate the fact that we're not alone, that this shit is going on and that there's a collective piece to this. Right. But what I realized in doing this was that, the term intersectionality, right? This idea of like different women's lives have different places where sexism intersects with different parts of their identity, right. Being a woman and other things. And so through this process, I've been able to listen to other, women and what their experience has been, and also appreciate that this is a lot. Expressing your anger is so loaded, not just for white women, right? But for women of color, this stereotype of the angry Black woman is real, right? Like, this is something that, I want to be able to hold space for people in a way where they feel seen and heard and invited to participate in a way where they're not re-traumatized. So this is my ongoing work, is to try to understand how to create those spaces and take responsibility if I'm the one that's creating the space to make it so that it's an anti-oppression space, an anti-racist space.
Right.
And that's an ongoing process for me of learning.
My other question to that would be, how would you hold that space? I don't know if this is a challenge, but how can you hold that space and center women of color in that space?
Exactly. And that is, I think, when I look at myself, I've never been a person that has not seen race, like the whole colorblind thing. That's not been, my thing. But what when I look at myself, and we've had this experience, we both volunteered for Sidewalk Talk, and we've certainly had this experience. But that's my biggest challenge, is that I'm used to my privilege of taking space. And that's the part that is so ingrained in me that I don't always even realize I'm doing it until after the fact. So raising my level of awareness and then actively, like purposefully making that part of the agenda is how I have to operate, because that to me feels like that gives women of color some room to move, right? To actually like drop in. But then also it gives me an opportunity to listen, so I can really appreciate at a deeper level what that experience is for women of color, but also what their needs are, right? How to be a co-conspirator, right? Like, what are the things that are the next level shit that needs to be addressed, that I may not be fully conscious or aware of right now, but I'm hoping by being in community with women of color and listening, that I'll understand what that path it will unfold.
Right. Okay. Well, let's move into white women violence and weapons of whiteness. For those of you who don't know, Catrice M. Jackson has coined the phrase white women violence, which is the emotional, verbal, and energetic weapons launched at you when you, as a woman of color, speak your truth. This can also show up as white tears, white guilt, you name it. If you've experienced it, for example, say you work at a tech company and your supervisor asks you to do something, and you just say to your supervisor, I've done this already, can you ask Jim to do it? And then your supervisor goes, oh, you need to ask Jim to do it. I mean, you work for me. And then you just go, okay, I'll do it. And then next thing you know, you're called in by HR because your supervisor feels that you violated their trust by asking them to ask someone else to do it. Like, that's a form of white women violence or weapons of whiteness. It's kind of a form of abuse, right? So, Valerie, have you used your whiteness as a weapon against women of color that you can think of, that you know of?
I mean, that's the inner work, right? And I have to say, yes, not to discount the times that, for example, I have used the space, right? Taken up all the space when I have received feedback, right? Not always kind of checking myself in terms of what my reaction is. I think that, again, there's this feeling of wanting to get it right. Like for white women who consider themselves conscious, right? Who want to do good in the world.
Right.
We put this pressure on ourselves to perfect it again, right? This idea of we've got to get it right. And I think we have to like just be willing to like own the fact that, yeah, we may fuck up and not try to, right? But at the same time, like, be willing to just listen and receive the feedback and apologize, right? For whatever that was, right? That you received that feedback, whether you intended it or not, right? Impact matters. And then not to expect that women of color are going to have to read us in or fix it, or, that we do the work and sit with it to understand how are we going to make a shift, right? Really own it. And that's tough. Some days it's, it's hard to see the path, but just being willing to be patient and understand that this is not like you're not going to earn a merit badge on this one, right? Like that's not what we're, that you never get to like, have the ally pin, right? Like, even
like the safety pin.
I mean, yeah. I mean that you have to basically, you have to earn it every day, right? And every moment. And that it's not something, even to be quite honest, coming to this realization really recently that I don't get to call myself an ally. I can work towards allyship, but it's actually women of color, who decide, right? Trying to be present for what that journey is going to look like, because it's not ever going to end.
Yep.
It's going to be an ongoing thing. So, the thing for me in terms of white rebels and violence is like that pressure on ourselves can lead to tears, and the tears are not helpful. So my big, piece of advice, what I try to do for myself is just sit there, and it may be uncomfortable, but just get comfortable with being uncomfortable.
Right. Cause that's what this process is all about. And I guess I want to ask, just have you ever seen a white woman violate a Black woman? And did you do anything about it?
That's a good question. Let's see.
Have you ever felt like, in your knowing of what white women violence is now, that you saw something happen with a woman of color and you can kind of just went to that white woman and was like, hey, that's not okay?
Right. So the times where I've seen it is typically when a woman of color's experience is being dismissed or minimized. And so what I've done in those situations is try to ask for them to listen, right? Like, hey, let's really hear what she's saying, right? Because often white women will just be like, oh, well, that's not really, they'll make excuses, right? Oh, that's not really what they meant, or da-da-da-da-da. It's oh, I hate the one, well, why do you have to make it about race, right? Like, they always want to think about it outside the context of race. And so I've tried to step in and facilitate and say, well, let's hear her out, number one, right? And validate and listen for what her experience is. And then let's talk about it, because race is a part of what's going on. So just trying to insert myself into the conversation. But to be quite honest, I've seen a lot more, and I feel like I've engaged a lot more when women of color are not present, where shit's being said, that's, got that white supremacist vibe, right? When women of color are not present. And that's when, back in the day, I didn't speak up, right? I would just be silent. And those are the places where I feel like I'm much more present around needing to use my voice in those situations.
Absolutely. And, because of this whole idea of white women violence and, white guilt, white tears, Black women, we've decided, women of color, that we're not going to emotionally labor for you all anymore. And a lot of Black women want to just throw Becky away. And, this whole idea of white woman violence has coined the term Becky, because it's just like, at the end of the day, you go home, you're stressed out, you're just like, God damn it, Becky. But I'm thinking on this idea when I hear people say, let's just throw Becky away. And I'm like, yeah, but that's kind of pushing that patriarchic message that you don't need anybody. And we're not meant to be in connection regardless of how hard it is to work through racial issues.
Yeah.
And so I personally think that the throwaway culture in America influences relationship building between
absolutely
women. And I personally believe it stemmed from patriarchy.
Mm-hmm.
So in your opinion, like, how do we break the cycle of throwing each other away and really healing to form a center of trust between the various races?
Absolutely. This concept of throwing people away, the first time I heard that term, I was on a call where somebody was talking about restorative justice. Mm-hmm. And it was an interesting concept. And to be quite honest, it's one that I'm only starting to get familiar with and unpack as a way to be able to kind of counteract this. But what they were talking about was this idea of community agreements,
Mm-hmm.
right? And that everybody, like when you're in community with somebody, that we bought in to the
Right, like in my face.
that you buy into some like ground rules, right? Some common things, and you get it out and you talk about it and you lay that groundwork up front. And I think to have it really up front in whatever that space is, to have it discussed and brought up and centered, right?
Mm-hmm.
And built into the process, I think gives hopefully some ability to then, when something has happened, come back in a way that can hopefully foster learning and growth and development. And I don't think that women of color always need to forgive and forget, right? Like that, I don't think that's realistic. Just like, anyone who's been harmed, like it's up to them to figure out what's right for them, right? In that situation, how they're feeling. But I do agree with you that we have to get better at being able to have difficult conversations in a way that aren't re-traumatizing, and to have built into our structures a way to be able to navigate and work through these and have like a common understanding that everybody's operating from. Because I think that the fact that's why I'm happy that you're having these kinds of discussions, is because I think that different people, we're all at different places of our appreciation of our journey. So when you're creating spaces, you're operating in spaces or relationships, having sort of like a relationship meeting, right? That talks about, okay, these types of things, like this is very real, and how are we going to deal with this?
So it's almost like restorative repair, right?
Yeah.
Like, this word from it, right? Where we have these spaces where, like you're saying, we come together through listening and dialogue to really repair these relationships with one another, and without the expectation of women of color doing all the work.
Exactly. And even that women of color, like that they need to be able to ask for what they need, right? And it might be a space. It might say, I can't engage right now or ever again. And that's okay, right? That it's not, I think that's sometimes where white women like clutch their pearls, is because it's the idea of like, you're throwing me away, right? Like, so it's like, yeah, guess what? That might be part of what this is. And you need to sit with that and appreciate what that feels like. So I think there's room for both. There's room for people needing, women of color needed to take care of themselves and saying, I can't do it. I'm not going to do it anymore. And I think there is space for, when there are communities and who are doing the work to set it up so that there's spaces for people to come together and work through it, that structure, building those structures and getting those in place.
Yeah. My question to that is, well, what happens when, I know that was just an example, a woman of color says, I can't do this right now, and sets that boundary. And then Becky gets violent, and when a Black woman disengages, that means, and this is from a personal experience, that there's like a mental health concern when I'm just disengaging. You feel me? Like,
absolutely,
layers to it.
Well, and that's where I think it's really easy to fall back into the defaults. And I agree with you that the throwaway culture and a lot of this also intersects with the patriarchy, right? And so this idea of undermining the credibility of people using mental health, emergencies or mental health as sort of the umbrella for like, oh, well, she's just, that's just, kind of disregarding it because, there's some history of mental health. I mean, to be quite honest, I don't know how you wouldn't be depressed in this, society right now, right? And the things that are going on, if it doesn't make you depressed and feel like you want to pull your hair out and be angry all the time, you're not awake, right? You're not alive. You're not feeling it. I mean, so part of it is learning how to be with those emotions I think what I heard you say is like, hey, what happens when I set the boundary as a woman of color
Right.
And the white woman basically blows right past it, right? Blows through it and continues their crusade for
Right.
their own like defending their honor often, I think, is what that, ends up showing up as. And I think that that's where white allies, right, can get off the fucking fence and step in and be able to play a role, right? And I think that's also where there's some learning about being in community together. Is as a white woman, I don't want to jump in too fast, because as a woman of color, you're used to dealing with this shit. I want to take your lead, right. But at the same time, I don't want you to feel like the fatigue aspect of having to deal with this all the time is real. And so I don't want you to feel like you're out there all alone. Exactly. And it's like, and so having these discussions around what, on a personal level, like you and I, we're friends, like what would feel supportive for you in situations like that, understanding so that, I can take your lead and then, move into action to be a buffer or to be another part of the chorus, right? Like, to harmonize your message and amplify it.
Right. So I see the importance of these communal safe conversations around support.
Oh, yeah.
Like really getting what we need as women of color.
Yeah. And being able to just like talk about it up front, that this is real and we're probably going to bump into this. How are we going to be thoughtful about it so that we're not, again, re-traumatizing and continuing to inflict harm? Because definitely there are people out there that is their intention, right? They consciously
do it,
doing it. But it doesn't matter if you're conscious of it or not, if you're intending to or not.
You still have to be careful. You still need to tread lightly. You still need to understand the power of your privilege.
Absolutely. And that is an ongoing thing. Like one day I may be really like grounded and in that understanding. And who knows, it may be me, right? One day. I don't want it to be. That's not what it is. But you and I being able to talk about what our relationship means, how we're going to, support, one another on this journey of, solidarity, basically, is my vision, right? That's what you're, I think, as well. You don't want to throw away, because we all need to come together to be able to make a difference in this world.
Yeah. Especially in this fight against white supremacy and the institutionalized systems. I think I was telling another speaker the other day, like, I have a nonprofit project, so I don't want to throw Becky away, because Becky has not Becky, sorry, not you, but
yeah,
you might have the experience of writing grants that can get responded to faster than I myself would, or someone else on my team would, as a woman of color. So it kind of goes into the idea of, well, let's move away from allyship and more into being co-conspirators. And that first step of being a co-conspirator is healing that traumatic racism, that traumatic experience, and just moving towards working together and making deeper impacts.
So the conspiratorship is the active engagement and crafting a plan and executing that plan in a way where we're working together, taking concrete steps to chip away at it.
Yep.
Okay.
All at the same time, where we're doing it together, but women of color are still the face of it, and women of color are still leading it, and women of color are centered in that.
Yes, absolutely. And that, for white women, I think that is going to take some practice around taking a step back and being okay with not always having to, be the one up there, right? Like, be the one that all the attention is on them. Because I think in a lot of ways, that's what we're used to, right? And has to be a conscious different. Like, you have to consciously say, no, actually, I don't need to be the one talking right now, right? I don't need to be the facilitator of this. Actually, I think, a woman of color facilitator is actually going to be able to make a difference and have an impact that I would not be able to.
Right. Absolutely.
Or this panel, it's yeah, it would be nice to be on this, conference panel, but actually there's not that many women of color faces. We talked about this at Wisdom, right?
Listen, I know I keep talking about this in these interviews. That was yeah.
I mean, it's real. It happens a lot where you look, and as a white person, I look around and there's not that many people of color, right?
Right.
Let alone women of color.
Or if there are people of color, women of color, and let's say they're the speaker, and this is my experience at Wisdom, it's almost like goddess worship. And
Right.
or if white people see us, they're just like, it's the death stare. I call it the white death stare. And you're just like, does this mean I'm welcome, or does this mean you've never seen a Black person before?
Right. And it's basically the cognitive dissonance, right? That you're seeing projected onto their face, where they're just like, I'm not sure what's going on here. Wait a minute. And that's the internalized racism, right? That's the internalized shit that they might even be conscious of.
Yep.
But there's something there, right? And that it's not there for white people, right? Like when they're looking at another white person.
Right.
So there's a lot to unpack. I mean, this is in our entire lives, and it continues.
It does not stop.
It does not stop.
Oh, but we're getting close to time. So I want to ask you a couple questions before we close. What advice are you willing to give women of color? Whoa, not women of color, white women.
No.
We are not. No. That would be me.
No.
But what advice or experience are you willing to give white women to check their privilege? And what ideas do you have about how they can center women of color in their life or in their business?
Right. So definitely educating yourself, right? Like, and this is not about like, go ask a person of color that you know what you should be reading, right? Like, just go, that's what Google's for. Like, Jesus Christ, like there's lots of books out there. And a friend of mine just recently posted on Facebook, like, hey, what are some, recommendations for books around white supremacy and white fragility, right? And a lot of people like threw out suggestions. And so just educating ourselves is the first step, because it needs to be written by a person of color. Number one also is like what you're reading, it needs to be from that centered position. And then once you're actually reading it and trying to process it, I've found that I have to just sit with it, right? And like slow my roll, because there's this sense of wanting to consume this stuff in a way where like, okay, I've arrived. I've read all the books. Check. I'm covered. And the real rubber hits the road when you're trying to be present for this stuff in your day in, day out reality. I called out somebody, a white woman, about something that she said, and I kind of jumped the gun. And the other woman of color who was present with me said, thanks, but I've got this, right? And so there's this eagerness sometimes, and I think sometimes we just have to sit with it. It's not about othering. It's not like about other white people. Like, just take it in that like it's in all of us. And our own internal work, I think, is the first place to start. And then in terms of centering women of color, notice the spaces that you're in. Notice the relationships that you have. Notice the people that you're reading or the media that you're consuming, and try to branch out, right? Like, try to put yourself in situations where you're the only white face, and just listen and just be present and connect and be willing to be uncomfortable.
I think that's good. I think also when you put yourself in these non-white spaces, be okay with sitting in the back.
Yes.
And be okay with not feeling the need to engage or overtake or project your ideas.
Yes.
Just
be present, right? Just be patient and present, and just quiet and listen. And like you said, let the women of color take the lead.
Yeah.
So
Absolutely.
that's what I'm personally working on, right? Those are the two things that I'm working on right now. Being in community with women of color, being open and receptive to deepening my appreciation for white fragility, white supremacy, how it shows up in institutions and structures, what are things I can do, and then where where it seems like I can make a difference, like stepping in and taking action.
I love that, Valerie. Thank you so much for sharing your wisdom and your
Yeah.
insight and for educating white women on how they can check your privilege.
Mm-hmm.
Before you guys sign out, I want you to go ahead and look at the Check Your Privilege Co-Conspirator Workbook. It comes with a series of questions and prompts that make sure you're centering women of color in your life. And Valerie, where can they find you if they need to reach you?
So they can reach me. My website is valeriemoore.com, VALERIEMOORE.com. So thank you so much for inviting me to participate and just for being, in community. I really, I love you.
Love you too. Thanks, guys, for watching. Bye.